which is Robin Glover talking about microhabitat selection as a function of web type and forest succession stage in spiders. Yeah, I see the screen coming. It looks great.
Okay, cool.
Okay, we can hear you. Okay, so you can start anytime. Thank you.
So hi everyone, my name's Robin Glover, and today I'll be presenting the project that I did as part of my honors thesis titled Microhabitat Selection as a Function of Web Type and Forest Succession in Spiders. So habitat selection is a major area of ecological research that studies not only where organisms exist, but why certain organisms select for some areas over others. Web-building spiders are particularly fascinating creatures to study questions considering habitat selection because they're uniquely reliant on the physical structure of their environment for things such as web attachment, as well as sensing their environment through vibratory cues. Previous studies have found that spiders that coexist within the same environment select for discrete microhabitats based on the physical structure of their web, as well as things such as predator protection and prey availability. While these different selection strategies have been frequently observed and recorded in literature, the exact factors that influence a spider's choice in website are still largely unknown. So webs can be divided into three different types. Orb webs are built along a single two-dimensional plane, whereas sheet and tangle webs have this three-dimensional geometry. Sheet and tangle webs can be differentiated from tangle webs by the presence of this dense layer of silk. Due to their different geometries, we assume that each web type has a particular set of structural requirements. So for orb webs, we assume that these require the least amount of structural support from their environment, and as a result, tend to be quite large in size and are quite flexible in the orientation of support structures that they require around their webs. On the other hand, tangle webs, we assume require the most amount of structural support from their environment, and therefore tend to be quite small in size and are very restricted in where they can be built, as they require a surface both above and below the web to hold the entire area of silk. Finally, for sheet and tangle webs, we assume that these require intermediate amounts of structural support from their environment. We assume that they're moderate in size and that they're less restricted in where they can be built than tangle webs, but still require support from multiple directions surrounding the sheet. So my project aimed to determine how these structural requirements influence where spiders with different web types build their webs. And more specifically, we aim to ask, how does forest succession stage influence the community of web building spiders in terms of the proportion of different web types? We hypothesize that the succession stage of the forest will determine the proportion of webs of different architectures, given the structural requirements of each web type. We considered two predictor variables in this study. The first being vertical gap size, which refers to the size of empty space in otherwise continuous vegetation in our site. And we chose this as a predictor variable because we found it to be correlated with succession level across our sites. We also decided to consider leaf size in our study, despite this not being correlated with succession level across our study sites, likely due to insufficient sample size. We still decided to consider this because it enabled us to test our hypotheses about the structural requirements of the webs. So when considering vertical gap size, we predicted that the ability of a web to take advantage of larger gaps in their environment would increase with the size of the web and decrease with the amount of structural support that the web requires from its environment. So we predicted that orbs would select for areas with larger gaps because they tended to be largest in size and required the least amount of support. We predict that sheet and tangle webs would be found in highest relative proportions in areas with moderate size gaps. And tangle webs, we predicted, would prefer areas with the smallest size gaps. For leaf size, we predicted that orbs would have no real preference for the size of leaves in their environment, as they do not require or rely on leaves to support any substantial section of their webs. We predicted that sheet and tangle webs would select for areas with lots of small leaves, as this provides a higher number of unique attachment points to support that sheet structure. And finally, for tangle webs, We predicted that these would be found in relative highest proportions in areas with moderate-sized leaves, as they require leaves to be largest enough to hold the entire area of the tangle, but leaves that are too big may present some challenges to the integrity of their webs. So on to how we went about collecting this data. So we did fieldwork in the summer of 2020 in Pacific Spirit Regional Park, which is a 763-hectare park located between UBC Vancouver campus and the other residential areas of the city. We collected data over 2 rounds, one beginning in late July and one beginning in late August, to account for potential seasonal differences that may have occurred throughout our sampling period. We measured data along 20 different transects, as shown by these blue dots, and ensured that the transects were located in a variety of different forest types, ranging from early successional forests, which tend to have smaller leaves and smaller gaps, to later successional forests, which tend to have larger leaves and larger gaps. So along each transect, we located 25 webs and recorded information about the physical structure as well as the microhabitat of each web. We also collected a voucher specimen from each web to later be ID'd in the lab. And finally, we record information about the general vegetation that was present at each site using 3 methods. So over the course of the summer, we ultimately collected 500 individual spiders that were ID'd to belong to 14 different genera, as shown by the phylogeny that I made here to the left. And these built a huge diversity of different web types. And the 3 shown here are just a small sample of the diversity that we saw in the park. So how did we quantify our data? So to analyze how the probability of finding each of the 3 web types varied with each of the environmental variables, I generated multinomial logistic regressions using the NNet package in R. So I made 3 different models, each with this general structure, with web type as the response variable, 1 or 2 of my predictor environmental variables as the predictor variables, week number is the fixed effect to account for potential seasonal differences that may have occurred throughout our sampling period, and transect code is a random effect to account for the fact that multiple webs were sampled along each transect. So here are our results for our first model, which considered vertical gap size as a predictor. And this was the predictor variable that was correlated with succession. In these plots, you can see how the effect of vertical gap size on the proportion of the 3 web types as predicted by the multinomial model. So the shaded region shows a 95% confidence interval, and the dashes along the x-axis show the vertical gap size values of the actual data that the model was based on. So as you can see by the p-values, this model showed that the 3 webs did not differ significantly in their response to vertical gap size. And since this variable was correlated with succession, this finding also fails to suggest that succession had a significant impact on the proportional composition of spiders. And this finding is likely because the proportional composition of spiders completely reversed between our first and second sampling round in this study. And this likely occurred because of differences in the physical structure of the webs throughout the season. So if we look more specifically at web size, we see that for both orbs and sheet and tangle webs, they increased in size between rounds 1 and round 2. So if we look more closely at just round 2 data, we see that orb webs actually did respond similarly to how we predicted, with them increasing in their relative proportions in areas with larger size gaps. And this probably only happened in round 2 because they were large enough to be able to take advantage of those larger gaps. And this finding is super interesting to me because it suggests that spiders are able to select for different aspects in their environment given their web size throughout the season. Next, if we consider leaf size, so my second model, we see that the 3 different web types did differ significantly in the response to leaf area in their environment. And while the trends were consistent between both of our sampling rounds, only sheet and tangles matched our predictions. So contrary to what we predicted, we see that orb webs increased with increasing leaf area in their environment. And I think this may be because orb webs or orb web building spiders are much more exposed to the sun. So they may select for areas that have larger leaves and therefore can provide them with more shade to prevent them from drying out. We also see, contrary to our predictions, that tangle webs preferred areas with smallest leaves as opposed to moderate sized leaves. And this may be because the tangle webs that we saw along the transects were incredibly small and therefore could potentially be supported by just even the smallest leaves. And finally, we decided to look at how seasonal phenology affected the proportional composition of the 3 web types. And this actually wasn't one of my initial predictor variables, but we noticed that week number significantly affected the spider composition in our other 2 models. So we decided to look more closely at how the spider community changed throughout our sampling period. So again, with this model, we see that the 3 web types did differ significantly in their response to week number, with orb webs increasing throughout our sampling period and sheet and tangle webs decreasing with week number. So this suggests that, I guess, the seasonal phenology had a significant impact on
10 minutes.
Had a significant impact on the proportional composition of the 3 web types. And the trends that were predicted by my model actually did match with the absolute abundance data that we collected as well. So in summary, contrary to what we predicted, we did not see a significant effect of succession level on the relative abundances of the 3 web types, since the variable that correlated with succession across our study sites was did not significantly affect the relative proportions. And this is likely because the preference of those 3 web types changed between our 2 sampling rounds. However, we did see a significant effect of both leaf size and seasonal phenology on the relative abundances of the 3 web types. So in addition to being one of the first studies to look at the spider community within Pacific Spirit Park, this project provides us useful information with understanding where spiders and why spiders build their webs in certain locations. And this information is super important because it enables us to predict how things such as habitat destruction may influence spider communities and spider diversity, which play crucial roles in ecosystems in both urban and natural settings, yet often go unnoticed by the public. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Rob Bennett for completing all of the spider IDs for this project, as well as the Aviles lab at UBC for all their help with this project.
Nice, great talk. Very well thought experiments and the hypothesis. And yeah, thanks. So now we are open for questions and discussions. If anyone wants to bring on something. Lots of congratulations.
Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, so everyone understood it completely. No questions for you. But of course, anyone can come to you, I guess, and ask questions if needed. Oh, there's one that came. We have time for questions. So yeah, you can answer this one. Sarah Rose asked, did any of your orb weaver use a curd leaf as a retreat? Do you think that played into this at all?
Yeah, we did notice that a lot of them, I think it tend to depend on the species, but a lot of the orb weavers did, we'd have to look for them when we were trying to find them, and they would often be kind of off to the side on one of the lines, hidden underneath a sort of larger leaf, which may also play into, yeah, the orb weavers tending to select for those larger leaves in areas, potentially, again, to protect them from the sun or also predators too. Yeah, it's a good question.
And she also asks, did you measure the size of the leaf they used?
We did note if they were using a refuge, but I don't think we measured the leaf of the refuge, but we did measure the size of the leaves just randomly throughout the area. as opposed to the ones that they were directly using for support.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, cool. Thank you, Robin, again for the talk. And now we will go